Okay, I think we can get started. All right. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Internet of Things, Another World is Possible, organized by Dar al-Funun the Khaled Shuman Foundation and curated by myself, Jude al-Tamimi, Kareem Maji, and Firas Shhade. Internet of Things is an exhibition project facilitating a collective inquiry from and through the quarantine. It is an invitation for reflecting on the situ from our active positions behind the screens, deconstructing the crisis, contingency, social structures, cyberspace, memes, anxiety, geography, and body politics, from the medium and its discontents to the state of emergency. The first phase of the program unfolds through an online residency and live streaming activities. I'd like to welcome our resident artists who joined the residency in its second iteration and are present with us today, Sulaiman, Juliana, Omar, and Bayan. I'd also like to welcome Kareem Estefan, who's our guest speaker for the day, and will be speaking on opacity, repair, and relation in an age of telepresence. Kareem Estefan is a writer, editor, art critic, and PhD candidate in modern culture and media at Brown University. He's currently living in Beirut, Lebanon, where he teaches film and media studies courses at the American University of Beirut and is writing a dissertation on the poetics of witnessing, opacity, speculation, and world building in Palestinian visual culture. He's the co-editor of Assuming Boycott, Resistance Agency and Cultural Production, an anthology of essays by artists, curators, activists, and scholars on boycott campaigns, transnational solidarities, and self-censorship in the arts. He's also the recipient of the 2020 Dar al-Funun Dissertation Fellowship for Modern and Contemporary Arab Art. Thank you, Kareem, for accepting our invitation to do this talk. It's a pleasure to have you be part of this program, and thank you all for joining us. I'm just going to ask everybody to keep their microphones muted during the lecture. We'll be doing Q&A in the final half hour, so please keep your questions until the end. Otherwise, we can start whenever you're ready, Kareem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jude, and thank you to Reem and to Firas as well for inviting me to be part of the ongoing conversation around Internet of Things and Other World is Possible. So the talk is a really welcome divergence from what I've been working on, which is mostly the dissertation that Jude mentioned, and goes back to research and teaching that I was doing before sort of tunneling in on Palestinian visual culture as my main object of study. But of course, the last few months as a whole have been a kind of distraction in which we're all pulled towards telepresence as a subject. So I have wanted to reflect on drones in particular, and more broadly on how our conceptions of subjectivity and identity are changing in relation to the forms of surveillance that we're seeing, say, on the streets as uprisings break out around the world, in the US and around the world, and also to our own sense of sort of being part of a broader surveillance network as we use Zoom and as we participate in new forms of telepresence. So this is something of a return to an older subject for me, so I'm aware that maybe all the threads won't fully be woven together, but I hope that in the Q&A we can do some of that with many of the artists who have been part of this show and who are here, wherever here is. And I'll begin by just explaining what I mean by telepresence and why I think about the drone as a networked media object that's sort of at the forefront of the Internet of Things and of defining what telepresence will be in the future. Just before that, actually, a bit of a digression to say that I'll come into the terms relation, repair and opacity later in the talk, but they're ones that I turned to as I was initially sort of writing about art that focused on state violence and the militarization of everyday life and mass surveillance, as I became sort of dissatisfied with the idea that artists were primarily making visible the invisible, which was a kind of line that was associated with many of the sort of tech-savvy artists who were countering surveillance practices, especially in a moment at the time several years ago when Edward Snowden had revealed many of the mass surveillance practices of the NSA, the CIA, and the sort of military state at the heart of US empire. And I think there was a kind of naive belief that critical exposure leads to radical changes in political consciousness, that exposure itself is enough, and that visibility is something that one can put faith in a number of levels. I mean, first, that surveillance actually operates primarily at the level of visuality, which these days in terms of data gathering, it doesn't so much as other modes, other senses and modes of capture, which is something I'll speak about. Also that, visibility and transparency are desired political relations, that, that it's important for identified subjects to make demands on the state, something that actually has been, has led to greater forms of repression for many oppressed communities. And, most importantly for me, that the conditions of visibility or invisibility, that they're not neutral, that they are radically different according to race, gender, class, geography, citizenship, and that so many sort of technically oriented projects of counter surveillance, of watching the watchers, of making visible the invisible didn't take these differences into account. So as I define telepresence, as I speak about why the drone is a kind of emblematic technology of telepresence, I want to unravel what I mean by a kind of imperial visuality and surveillance as a racializing act, and as an act that makes and unmakes identities in terms of race, gender, class, and other forms of differentiation through its practices. That we're not just talking about racialized surveillance, but racializing surveillance, to use Simone Brown's phrase, which I'll go into more. But so first, what is telepresence? And I'm gonna share my screen here. Sorry, I'm just getting used to the share screen function. I've been lucky not to be too telepresent these last few months because I haven't actually taught this past semester, so it's been a bit of a break from it. But so a book that I find very useful for thinking about telepresence is this one by Chris Paulson, a media scholar, who looks at a range of possible definitions of telepresence. There's a kind of scholarly debate about, if what we're doing, talking across time zones on Zoom, is actually telepresence or simply telecommunications. To be telepresent, one argument goes, you have to be able to affect a remote environment, not just apprehend it through one's senses. So some would argue that the relation to a distant place has to be haptic, that is based on touch, and not just communicative or visual, based on hearing, speaking, seeing. So if the activity in question is primarily communicative, I'd say like a lecture or like a meeting, like a conversation, we can call this kind of Zoom conversation telepresence because there isn't a kind of effect on the other side of the world that is lacking, that would be present if we were physically proximate. But if I weren't a writer, but a masseuse or something, Zoom obviously would not be a technology of telepresence because I cannot fulfill the function that I'm used to with Zoom. And so there are a lot of in-betweens that are interesting in a moment, like the COVID era. My sister's a nurse practitioner in New York, and she's been seeing patients via Skype. So telemedicine is something that's growing, and she can't use a stethoscope or feel someone's sinuses to know physically how they're doing, but she relies on their kind of self-reporting. So that's a kind of limited form of telepresence that relates actually to a lot of drone technologies around humanitarianism and medicine that are being developed. So I have on the screen, which I won't read, some of Chris Paulson's definitions of telepresence, but I also want to refer to Derek Gregory, a scholar of drone warfare and more broadly neo-colonial warfare, so-called war on terror, which I think captures some of the sort of terrifying imperial aspects of telepresence in the age of drone warfare. So this idea, he was researching drone bases in Nevada, where drones are largely operated in the United States. There are bases all over the country, but especially in the Southwest, which has long been a site for military testing, something that is not unrelated to the US's settler colonial history, as indigenous peoples' land have often been used for places of testing. They will not be heard as they complain about radiation. They're not thought of as part of the body politic that has to be, environmental racism, in short, is the thing I won't go into in depth, but when pilots are in Nevada, they report being 18 inches from the battlefield, Gregory says, referring to the distance between the eye and the screen. And he relates an anecdote in which a visitor was told, inside that trailer is Iraq, inside the other, Afghanistan. So this, what he calls the effortless sense of time-space compression that is exceeded only by its casual imperialism. This is something that I want to look at more through a kind of genealogy of visuality in which the predator is associated with an objective or distant viewer that gradually becomes more and more distant from his prey. And telepresence has all kinds of novel dimensions. This is robot, and with all these telerobotics instances, I think you have to look at the gender dynamics, especially if you've seen the film Her, or know of any, we can begin with Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, the ways that robots are feminized in order to serve as servants to the men who command them. That's just a side note as I flip through a few of the telerobotics examples I'll go to. So for thinking about the Internet of Things in particular, a book that's very useful is Life in the Age of Drone Warfare by Lisa Parks and Karen Kaplan. And in addition to looking at state sovereignty, international law, drone warfare, topics that are normally addressed with drones, they speak about some things that I want to highlight as particularly pertinent to this moment of COVID and what Naomi Klein calls COVID capitalism, which is this broader trend towards automation and robotics and digitization, and also the changes in perception that they develop. So again, this is where we should think together with Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto in terms of new sensory capacities that human operators learn as they fuse their own perception with networked machine perception. And you can also think more classically with Marshall McLuhan about drones as an extension of man, but also an amputation in the sense of what sensory capacities we lose and what we become less aware of as we become more telepresent. And also say that drones are ideological objects, which is to say that they shape our cultural imaginaries the same way that they mirror them through their programming, that they both are embedded with and they reproduce ideology. So this is probably an image many of you saw on TikTok or YouTube. And there have been all kinds of uses of drones to alert people to go back in lockdown. And, you know, in addition to the rise of working from home and new delivery services, I'd say COVID has led more broadly to a new moment for the so-called humanitarian drone. And it's being deployed in this case, you know, to warn an elderly Chinese woman about going back into lockdown, but has also been used to spray streets with disinfectants, to deliver medical supplies and other necessities, and to measure body temperatures. So in theory, you know, just as armed drones are supposed to protect the US soldiers or other soldiers that wage war from the safety of military bases rather than them going into ground combat, these drones are meant to protect civil officials working in public health. But the public health benefits are absolutely unclear. Research has shown that disinfection through aerial spraying doesn't work, it's ineffective. And the fever detecting drones that would prevent officials from coming near potentially infected citizens do nothing, as studies have shown that they can detect temperatures only plus or minus 5 degrees Celsius. So of course, between 37, 42, 32, you don't learn much about whether someone has COVID. Humanitarian drones are a broader trend, though. This is an advertisement from Zipline, which is a San Francisco-based company that's probably most associated with providing medicine, blood, water to rural communities, particularly in Rwanda, but elsewhere. You know, aside from looking at the image and probably associating it already with a kind of critique of NGO humanitarianism broadly, in terms, well, I won't go into that in full now. Something that Catherine Chandler, a scholar of drones, identifies here is, you know, how Rwanda in particular has become a hub for Western organizations that want to test out new drone technologies without any local sort of community desire for drones in particular, or for that kind of technological development. There's a need for the waters and medicines, that is, but there isn't a kind of vision of the infrastructural or social development that might be necessary to transport those things, to move people around in the future. Instead, there's a kind of technological fix that that serves primarily as a kind of laboratory for the same technologies to be exported around the world. And Zipline, while it restricts its technologies to humanitarian uses, has partnered with the US military. So the question, you know, as with other critiques of liberal humanitarianism in the global South more broadly, becomes what political structures do these humanitarian uses of new technologies build in the long term? Like, even if we grant that in the short term, the use of these drones to provide medical aid is effective, is cost efficient, reduces illnesses and death, there's that trap of technological solutionism, the idea that organizing at a local level can be replaced by new tools, but also a familiar dynamic in which a formerly colonized people become test subjects in a kind of imperial laboratory. So where will the knowledge and technology that is extracted through this laboratory testing migrate next? But the point for drone developers isn't to supply the best public health solution. It's to pitch their products at a moment when governments and nonprofit agencies are looking to buy technological quick fixes. It's a test run for their future profitability. It's a large-scale experiment at a moment of emergency that companies hope will normalize these technologies well beyond the emergency. By far the biggest developer of non-military drones is a company called DJI, based in Shenzhen, which controls more than 70% of the global market. I threw up a headline about it and a nice Orientalist image for you with them selling some consumer drones. It's actually at a moment of crisis, both trying to pitch its technologies at a much greater scale, given the moments of lockdown, but also dealing with scandals and US-Chinese trade wars. Given that the US and China are competitors in exporting drones, both consumer and military, this is a decisive moment in a lot of ways. the drones were ready for this moment, as the New York Times recently wrote, anthropomorphizing the drones in a way that, you know, along with RoboCop and so many science fiction movies, both normalizes and terrifies. It normalizes drones as something that may become part of our everyday social life, and sort of creates an apocalyptic vision that we have an immediate reaction against, but I think we have to, you know, think through. So in terms of, you know, the social context to this more broadly, I think it's important to maybe look back at that paradigm for the wake of the September 11th attacks, in which we spoke, people, you know, broadly critical thinkers, people on the left spoke of the normalization of the state of emergency as an explanation for the launch of an endless war on terror, for the expansion of surveillance, for the inauguration of a kind of global regime of torture and secret prisons, from Guantanamo to CIA black sites around the world. And I think that perpetual state of emergency remains a useful paradigm when thinking about drone warfare in particular, since assassination by drone rests on the legal ground that was paved by the authorization for the use of military force passed by the US Congress shortly after September 11th, with only one vote against it from Barbara Lee in California. But if we want to think about not only drones and surveillance in the context of warfare, but more broadly about the acceleration of technologies of telepresence, I'd say the more helpful framework is what Naomi Klein has called very influentially disaster capitalism. And in that book and in a recent video on COVID capitalism, she quotes Milton Friedman, the economist, the free market propagandist, who wrote in his introduction to Capitalism and Freedom, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function: to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. And that, I think, applies equally to the COVID crisis, but also the crisis in policing, in white supremacy, in the legacies of colonialism that we're seeing now. Because on the one hand, the ideas lying around, thankfully, are defunding and abolishing the police, are, ideas of universalizing healthcare and creating things like a universal basic income. But on the other hand, are the use of extensive new facial recognition databases and all kinds of militarized telepresence that I'll get into. So the language of this article, which I just have up there, I even as it alludes to these fears of an Orwellian drone age or a robo-apocalypse, is all about this kind of novel agency of drones as laborers in themselves. And it shows the kind of breathless awe you see in a lot of technology reporting. You saw this a few years ago when newspapers sort of gobbled up the story of the first Domino's pizza that was delivered by drone in New Zealand. We get the same kind of kick out of an image like this, taken in Cyprus, that went viral, of a drone walking a dog. I'll go to that in a second. But in addition to the concerns more broadly that I've been raising around surveillance, around repression at this moment, we should really take seriously the role of drones in relation to labor, because they are, again, part of a broader trend of telepresence that includes AI, robotics, all sorts of technologies that of automation that are rendering many jobs obsolete. It's a moment that we have to think through, especially because we're seeing mass unemployment already, in which many millions of jobs will not return after the pandemic. And at the same time, we're seeing that people like Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, have made I think the figure was $44 million in a few months because of because his empire is so tuned into the trends of automation. And he, by the way, Amazon, you've probably heard, has promised a prime air service that would deliver products by drone within 30 minutes of ordering. Alphabet, the parent company of Google, beat out Amazon in terms of federal approval in the US for drone delivery. And Walmart actually might be better positioned because consumer drones can't fly that far. And Walmart has more physical locations than Amazon does. But all of these different corporations are at this moment positioning themselves at a moment when people want to do distant delivery rather than go to stores for a kind of automated delivery that will take away millions more jobs. So I wanted to speak about a film that brings together telepresence in labor as well as in warfare and policing, which are increasingly the same thing. This is a film called Sleep Dealer, directed by Alex Rivera in 2008. It presents this kind of matrix-like vision that's much more historically specific, in which people in Mexico are hooked up to virtual jobs in the United States. As the film says with a great deal of wit, this is the American dream. We give the United States what they've always wanted, all the work without the workers. It's premised on this idea that the fencing between the US and Mexico has been fully completed. The wall was built. Rivera said, that he wanted to respond to sci-fi films in which the drama always comes from robots killing people. He says, in my film, people use machines to exploit each other. The robot doesn't want to kill you. The robot wants to take your job. He was thinking about more and more people working from home in general already at that point, and about the historically shifting US policies on Mexican labor, specifically the Bracero program, which is something we should think about now because it was a temporary guest worker program that was implemented after the deportations of the Great Depression, but also about border militarization, drone warfare, climate change, and struggles over natural resources. So in this film, the main character, Memo, gets plugged into a construction job in San Diego thanks to these nodes that make him a cyborg subject. He purchased them from a coyotech. Coyotes are the people who facilitate passing across the border. A coyotech in the film is those who facilitate virtual crossing across the border. And this applies to blue collar workers and white collar workers as well. This is Luz, who becomes his love interest, who's a material labor, also depends on nodes. She's a kind of blogger, and her video stories are uploaded directly from her brain. The whole show hinges on both drone warfare and its representation on TV, in that Sleep Dealer imagines this cops-inspired show, Drones, that dramatizes the pursuit of racialized terrorists from the perspective of US drone pilots who are presented as patriotic heroes. And that becomes significant in the film because Memo's home is near a water reserve that has been appropriated by a US corporation. When he and his father try to take water for themselves, they're branded as aqua terrorists and pursued by a US drone, which kills his father, leading him to work remotely in the US. So I want to give a little bit of a history of drone warfare more broadly, while not going into this too much, so that I have some time afterwards to speak about artistic responses. And before saying that, actually, since many of you read Cyborg Manifesto, either in the reading group for the show or just previously from reading Donna Haraway, the thing that I want to emphasize in her essay is that, cyborgs for her come out of a history of domination but can betray their origins. She writes, the main trouble with cyborgs, of course, is that they are the illegitimate offspring of militarism and patriarchal capitalism, but illegitimate offspring are often exceedingly unfaithful to their origins. So she's, arguing against a kind of Luddite or anti-technology position, and arguing for a socialist feminism that thinks about who cyborgs will be and how they can responsibly construct relations with others, whether those others are machines and networks, animals, plants, any form of any organism or hybrid organism. And she's also saying, the political struggle, in her words, is to see from both perspectives at once. That is, the one that regards the cyborg as an offspring of a militarized capitalist state, and the perspective that sees the cyborg as a kind of liberated hybrid subjectivity. So like the internet, like the cyborg, the drone is a military technology that's infusing every domain of life. And the question I think that I want to raise is, can the forms of telepresence and altered perception that it enables be repaired and reconstructed towards new forms of relation, ones that don't replicate imperial visuality and racializing modes of seeing? At this point, the US and Israel are the two countries really developing military drone technology and exporting it to most of the world, though China is catching up recently. I won't go into a full sort of genealogy of military drone history. The book I mentioned earlier does that well, as does Catherine Chandler's new book, Unmanning: How Humans, Machines, Media Perform Drone Warfare. But the history of the use of armed drones maps pretty cleanly onto the history of the war on terror. After the September 11th attacks, Bush authorized the first use of armed drones. The first assassination by drone killed 5 al-Qaeda members in Yemen in November 2002. And the use of drones then expanded to Afghanistan, Iraq, and other countries the US was not at war with, like Pakistan and Somalia. The CIA came to play a greater role. And Obama, who campaigned on ending the war in Iraq, on closing Guantanamo and ending torture, embraced the drone war because he saw it as more humane, as more precise. He launched 10 times as many strikes as Bush, and he was the first to assassinate US citizens by drone, including not only al-Qaeda militants, but the 16-year-old child of one, Abdurrahman al-Awlaki. And the US defended its assassinations by pointing to an Israeli Supreme Court decision from the Second Intifada. So there's always a lawfare in addition to a technological and military warfare relationship between the US and Israel in developing these imperial so-called anti-terror technologies. Under pressure from activists, Obama did limit the use of drones outside of war zones in 2013, promised greater transparency, issued an executive order later that civilian casualties be counted, but Trump has unrolled all of these reforms, which were executive actions and therefore very easy to unroll. And in Trump's first 2 years in office, he launched more strikes than in all of Obama's 8 years. Civilian deaths have risen dramatically, but you wouldn't know that from looking at the media, since it's distracted by other things that Trump is doing. And drones have not been in the news for a long time, even though as recently, well, not a long time, there was the killing of Qasem Soleimani, which we thought would be why 2020 would be so disastrous before all that's happened since. The end of 2019 saw, for example, the killing of 30 farm workers in Afghanistan by a drone strike. They were picking pine nuts and were mistaken supposedly for a group of militant jihadists. So this is just a map of where drones are spreading right now in terms of warfare. But I want to move forward a bit to speak about how drones are developing new models of surveillance that basically are what we could call persistent and totalizing. I'm drawing from Gregoire Chamayou, who wrote a great book called A Theory of the Drone in 2013. I won't go into all of these points because I want to skip ahead, but basically showing that an entire city can be made can be recorded as if there were a film from every possible perspective and then mapped onto other forms of data. And what I want to highlight here is what Aimé Césaire called the boomerang effect. And Hannah Arendt and other thinkers in the mid-20th century thought about this in particular in relation to basically how the Nazi Holocaust happened, how technologies of extermination and racism that had been developed in European colonies for so long came back to the imperial center and were applied to a racialized minority, to Jewish people, as well as other minorities and dissidents in Europe. And we can speak about the boomerang effect too in terms of military technologies that are used in Iraq and in Afghanistan and elsewhere, coming back to the US's internal colonies, mostly Black, mostly indigenous areas within the US, such as Baltimore and Compton, where technologies that were specifically developed for surveillance or for warfare through occupation in Iraq have come back and been used by police departments. So I just have up a little excerpt about that from a recent article speaking about a company called Persistent Surveillance that after the Freddie Gray protests in Baltimore, uprisings similar to the ones we're seeing now, although less widespread, more localized, the FBI first put Baltimore under surveillance, and then police department brought in a private company that made much more wide area surveillance that was developed by someone who had initially used these technologies to create digital archives of entire cities in Iraq, what he called Google Earth with TiVo capability. But it's important to say we can't conceive the boomerang effect as a unidirectional or singular movement from empire's peripheries back to the colonized communities at its center. We have to think, I think, about a spectrum of imperial technologies and perspectives developed broadly since European colonial expansion and expulsion, going back, that is, to 1492 to 1619. And I want to do that with some thinkers who are helpful in tracing an anti-colonial genealogy of vision and visuality, specifically Simone Brown and Nicholas Mirzoff. So Simone Brown made some big interventions into surveillance studies with her 2015, or I believe, yeah, 2015, I think, book, Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, where she changed the kind of narrative around surveillance, not to begin with Jeremy Bentham and the model of the panopticon that he developed as read by Michel Foucault, but instead looked at the history of discipline and surveillance through the history of slavery in the United States and the Americas more broadly, since the two are historically overlapping projects. So her book asks, what if we think about the slave ship as a space of confinement, the plantation as a space of discipline, and passcodes as early modern forms of surveillance? She uses Black feminist studies as a tool to think about surveillance studies more broadly, which leads her to conceptualize surveillance through what she calls racializing surveillance, which for her is when enactments of surveillance are not only racist in effect, but actually produce inscriptions of and identifications with a racial order. So they reify boundaries along racial lines, she says, thereby reifying race. And the outcome of that is often discriminatory and violent treatment. She also says, expanding on that, that this phrase suggests how things get ordered racially by way of surveillance, but it's subject to change. That's why she uses racializing rather than racialized, even as it most often upholds strategies that first accompanied European colonial expansion and transatlantic slavery, which sought to structure social relations and institutions in ways that privilege whiteness. So I said some of this and want to skip ahead, but she's asking then, how might the view from under the hatches of a slave ship be another site from which to conceptualize the operation of power? That is, what if we weren't looking at the panopticon and thinking about looking back or watching the watchers, or making the invisible visible, as I was speaking about earlier, but about the perspective of people enslaved, kidnapped in the Middle Passage and looking up from the hatches on the ship. So this is a diagram that she points to, that Nicholas Mirzoff also points to in his genealogy of visuality, to speak of oversight, whether we're speaking about oversight on a plantation or in a slave ship. Oversight, of course, is etymologically very close to surveillance in French. This is a diagram that was actually used for abolitionist campaigns, but shows the kind of what Donna Haraway in another essay calls the conquering gaze from nowhere, a view from nowhere that seeks to see and not be seen, to represent while escaping representation. So this is a kind of visuality that Nicholas Mirzoff says classifies, separates, and makes a separation seem aesthetic and right. And he has a kind of genealogy moving from a plantation complex to an imperial complex, which is actually where the word visuality is defined by a general. An example is this scene, as well as other scenes from the Battle of Algiers, a general, French general, looking into the Kasbah, calling the Algerians rabbits in a cage, and looking with binoculars, you know, a kind of predecessor in many ways to the kind of visuality of a drone, and the forms of dehumanization and distancing that go along with drone visuality, which Mirzoff calls post-panoptic visuality, and we can think of as the kind of mapping of the world as a target. I have more there on the age of the world target, on thinking about the world as a target, and this relationship between the I, that is the self, and the I as an instrument of vision, the bodily organ, and the other as opposed to self and the target, and how those map onto each other. But I want to make sure that we get to some of the responses to these forms of oversight or surveillance, to think about opacity, repair, and relation. So this is, you know, I was speaking a bit about the limitations of visibility, but I think this is one of the more poignant examples of a kind of humanizing and making visible against the dehumanization of the other when they're approached as a target. It was put together by a Pakistani community after drone strikes had killed both the parents and siblings of this child, pictured here in a blown up pixelated image that could be seen from 30,000 feet above, from a drone's height, a drone's altitude. But then also I want to speak about what Nicholas Mirzoff calls the right to look, and what Simone Brown calls the right to look back, or black looks. Simone Brown also has this concept of dark surveillance, which is a different conception of watching the watchers, because she notes that it comes particularly from a position of darkness, which she means to encompass blackness as a kind of identity, but also blackness as opacity or as limitless. She speaks about dark matter, the title of her book, as what structures the galaxy through its physical forces, but is unseen, or at least undetected, unnoticed by dominant conceptions of society. Of course, it's seen by some. And she quotes bell hooks on black looks, saying, speaking of a kind of defiance of Jim Crow prohibitions on reckless eyeballing, which is to say that in the moment after slavery was formally abolished, with the construction of all kinds of racist and segregationist laws, there was a prohibition on Black people broadly in the US looking the wrong way, supposedly, at white people and white women in particular. Of course, this is most famous through the lynching of Emmett Till for supposedly looking at a young white woman in the wrong way, an incident that has been repeated many, many times well beyond Jim Crow history. So the right to look back can be conceived in many ways. This is a project by Jeanette Ehlers in which refugees, migrants, people of color are invited to look back within an exhibition space in Denmark, where many were denied asylum and placed into ghettos with terrible conditions. This is an image from an earlier wave of Black Lives Matter protests, also around the slogan, "I can't breathe," after Eric Garner was killed by a police officer by chokehold, and then he was not indicted and remained on the force, receiving a huge salary for years afterwards. So here the right to look is also for Nick Mirzoff, what he calls countervisuality, and associates with a rejection of the police's command to move along. There's nothing to see here. He's summarizing Jacques Rancière on aesthetics and politics there, saying that, you know, political action is about redistributing the visual, looking at what we are told not to see against the policing function, which is not simply the police as individual cops or cop agencies, but an anti-political function within society that says there's nothing to see here. But one thing I want to differ on with Mirzoff is his definition of the right to look as a kind of realist countervisual practice. And, you know, using the bell hooks quote I mentioned earlier about her stare changing reality, and thinking about this piece by the South African artist Robin Rode called Pan's Opticon, which is on the cover of Simone Brown's book Dark Matters, I wonder if the right to look can also be conceived as a right to speculate and to build new worlds. When we speak about looking, maybe we think not only about surveillance, about looking from below, about looking from under the hatches, but also about looking as a subaltern mode of speculation. Just to bring in another example of surveillance and reclaiming a right to look, and specifically reclaiming vertical sovereignty, that is the right to see from above, the sort of imperial visuality when it's associated with drones. But in this case, at Standing Rock, at the indigenous protests against an oil pipeline that was being constructed on their territory and endangered their water resources. This is a filmmaker and water protector who was making drone footage of the protests, and his drone was continually shot down by police forces, but he was claiming sovereignty over not only the land, but over the airspace, and you know, said publicly to the police, if you want to bring up a no-fly zone, which is what the Obama administration instituted for a while, you need to go to the tribal council and make your request to them. So what it is also to claim sovereignty over the air and the land below, a major issue both in terms of indigenous peoples in Americas and Turtle Island, and in Palestine, where Al Wiseman has written about vertical sovereignty as the way that Israel exercises control over the air and water. So then moving from looking back to opacity, this is probably, you know, an example of the most colloquial sense in which opacity is used, that is blocking surveillance through a refusal of visibility or transparency. It's an artist named Everest Pipkin who made this tool, Image Scrubber, available to protesters over the last few weeks, so that, you know, they would be protected from police and FBI surveillance. There were many stories of arrests through surveillance, so tools like this are extremely useful as tactics. There are all kinds of reasons to worry about the use of facial recognition at this moment. I won't go into that because I don't have too much time right now. But I want to speak about a sort of more robust definition of opacity coming from Zach Blass, an artist and scholar. He made a video, a set of performances and installations centered around 3D masks that you see here in pink, which he made in response to a study that demonstrated, for some reason, the purpose of the study is not so clear, that people could determine from cropped faces whether someone was gay or straight within a split second, within less than a second. So why would this study be conducted, he was asking, and how can we defend against the reinscription of homophobic stereotypes of a fag face, as he says he was often bullied under that phrase as a child, which is what brings up the title. And at the same time, there were uprisings that were using masks to avoid repression in the same way as the opacity tool I just mentioned. Occupy Wall Street, although New York revived a 19th century law against masks to make sure that people didn't cover their faces. Pussy Riot, and much earlier actually the Zapatistas, indigenous people in Chiapas, Mexico, who were rising up against the passing of a free trade deal, NAFTA, in 1994, and are always seen wearing balaclavas. In the words of Subcomandante Marcos, they hide their face so that they can be seen. I think a very beautiful expression of what an alternative mode of visibility is when paired with opacity. So Blass calls this a tactic of opacity and draws from Edouard Glissant, who I'll turn to in a moment pretty quickly. Just the significance of what he's calling informatic opacity here is that it depends on a kind of defiance of technical standards and algorithmic models that define what a normal human or human part is. So this isn't about surveillance per se, that is just vision, but about what a computer scientist named Philip Agri called capture, which is about these, the creation of these protocols that determine a sort of normal set and are acted upon. So for systems to recognize faces, for example, they have to be programmed with a standard face. And to give you an idea of what that typically means, a recent MIT study found that facial recognition software that was in use had a 0.8% error rate with light-skinned men, but a 34.7% error rate with dark-skinned women. And so Blass argues that these kinds of capture and biometric technologies bring back standards of identification similar to 19th century forms of pseudoscience that led to eugenics in many places in the US and in Nazi Germany in particular. And it's a conception of identity that reduces identity to aggregates of data. And therefore cannot encapsulate the identity of what he calls minoritarian persons. It produces a conception of the human as that which is fully measurable, quantifiable, knowable, similar to the quantified self phenomenon in which we all track ourselves through different data on our watches or on our computers. So implicit here is not only the racist and sexist reductions through standardization, but also a disavowal of other aspects of identity that are not visible. The unconscious, for example. I could go in a sort of psychoanalytic dimension around opacity, though that's not what I'm going to be doing here. So some counter-surveillance projects clearly don't think through elements of difference in surveillance, and I won't go too far into this because I want to get ahead now, but Adam Harvey, a prominent artist who I think, for all the technical modes of combating surveillance, which became very fashionable, just never really grappled in this project with differences in race, gender, geography, something that became very clear with his anti-drone wear, which sold for as much as $2,500, and spoke of the burqa as a repressive garment and enhancing it and endorsing it from a very distant perspective that was not self-critical about what forms of opacity he was promoting and denouncing. So Zach Glass has explored this more in relation to Edouard Glissant's thought, which I want to speak about a bit now before finishing. Glissant is an important figure in debates about colonialism, identity, and language in the Caribbean, known as the theorist of créolité, that advocated the use of hybridized vernaculars of French, African, and indigenous languages against the kind of top-down transmission of a standardized and supposedly correct French. So thinking about language, identity, difference, and hybridity led him to theorize opacity as an opposition to universalisms that impose standards on identity and language. And he he says there's been a movement towards a liberal multicultural acceptance of difference, but only on the precondition that subjects who are seen as different are made fully transparent and weighed on a sort of ideal scale, what he calls an ideal scale, so that in order to understand and accept you, he writes, I have to measure your solidity with the ideal scale, providing me with the grounds to make comparisons and perhaps judgments. So when Glissant opposes opacity to transparency, he's not calling for a cutting off of relation with the West. He's arguing for a kind of undoing of scales, of standards, of norms, the kinds of norms that are being reimposed through biometric processes now. And he's emphasizing relation, but with the caveat that relations must be built not on the basis of understanding in the sense of making transparent. So he uses the French word comprendre, highlighting how it sort of connotates an encircling, a grasping, and appropriating, but of just accepting the unknowable in all of us, the opacity of the self and the other. And so that's something that needs to be considered, I think, in any definition of opacity in relationship to surveillance, to drones, to telepresence today. And now I'll finally get to some relational and reparative responses and finish up with these. So, there's a kind of paradox for people who have been made invisible, for indigenous peoples, for Palestinians, for many people of color around the world, for LGBTQ people, in which visibility has been the term of struggle. Edward Said famously said at the first US Film Festival, US Festival of Palestinian Films in 2003, the whole history of the Palestinian struggle has to do with the desire to be visible. But at this moment, actually, even though Said wisely differentiated between visibility from invisibility and hypervisibility, that is associations of Palestinians with masked protesters, with terrorists, even so, more Palestinian artists are exploring opacity, I think, both as a response to Israeli surveillance and more broadly to the forms of visibility that are encouraged by dominant modes of bearing witness, funded by NGOs, film festivals. So I'd argue that that kind of visibility is a kind of neo-colonial rendering transparent according to a dominant scale of the human, along the lines of what Glissant was explaining. So in the Palestinian context, there are a number of projects taking up masking in different ways. This one by Yazan Khalili shows Lara Khaldi, the curator, blocking her face from iPhone facial recognition technology, but also makes an analogy to the looting of indigenous objects and their status within museums to speak about colonial appropriation at the same time as imperial technologies of surveillance. This by Bassel Abbas and Rouana Bourahmeh is a kind of reappropriation of appropriated Neolithic masks dug up by Israeli archaeologists, which they 3D printed and had Palestinians wear as they returned to their destroyed villages for video and related projects. I'll skip this one. And I want to finish with a few images from their first sort of well-known video installation, The Incidental Insurgents, to look at these figures with their backs turned, witnessing not the violence of the present, but the possibilities for world building within it. So the back to the viewer has a long history as a trope in Palestinian visual culture, most notably with Naji al-Ali's Handala character, who's always bearing witness to the suffering of his people, but also to many examples in film and visual art that cite Handala directly or indirectly. But here we have a call not to witness suffering, to an invitation to repair, to rebel, to transform together. And I'd say that this is a kind of opaque and relational witnessing in that nothing is revealed about these figures. They're not humanized, they're not identified, rendered sympathetic in any way. We're invited to identify with their gaze, the direction of their gaze, and with the sound and text that accompanies the video, suggesting the emergence of other worlds. And just to conclude, I've turned to projects by Palestinian artists here in a way that's not incidental. As one other thing I'd like to say about telepresence is that diaspora and exile are already forms of telepresence. We shouldn't only think technologically if we want to think about repair and relation. Many of us know the feeling of being here and there at the same time when we read news about our homes, when we worry about family that remains there, or think about how, had our families not been displaced, we might be enduring occupation, bombing, state violence of all kinds. And there are also many reparative projects in which Palestinians with US or Israeli citizenship, or Jewish Israelis or Americans standing in solidarity with Palestinians, visit places that Palestinians are restricted from going and take pictures, report on their former homes and villages, bring back precious objects, all modes of reparative telepresence, I'd say. So there's the beautiful project you probably know by Emily Jasser, Where We Come From, where she fulfills the wishes of Palestinians that don't have the mobility afforded by her passport. There are young artists like Razana Saleh, who explores her family's street in Haifa via Google Earth in a short poetic video that sort of reflects on the changes to that street. And outside of Palestine, but also related, there are also disturbing projects that I'd still call reparative, like Wafa Bilal's Domestic Tension, in which he simulated the drone warfare that had killed his brother in Iraq at a checkpoint during the US occupation by confining himself to a small room in a gallery, inviting virtual visitors, online visitors, to shoot at him with a paintball gun for 30 days and starting conversations with those visitors in a chat room. So those are some kinds of reparative telepresence that I'd like to think about, together with the opacity and the relational witnessing that I've suggested. So I'll open it up to questions and discussion here. I hope I didn't go on too long, because I realized through screen sharing that I could not see any of you for the last 50 minutes or so. And I hope it was 50 minutes and not too much more. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Kareem. Yeah, that was incredible, actually, and I was hoping for more, like waiting for more, also to hear from you on telepresence and drones, and also like regarding this Internet of Things, the exhibition, but also the Internet of Things, the technical aspect of the new normal, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know, like if Jude and Reem, do you have something to say about it, or should I? Because I have, like, I've been writing so much, like, with like there is so much thinking about, and also like the references you made during the lecture.
I'm sorry if it was a lot and fast for us.
What?
I'm sorry if it was a lot spoken quickly. I think when you invited me, there was so much I wanted to say, but I hope there's a beginning sort of to...
Yeah, no, it's amazing.
I know so many people here have worked on both similar theoretical approaches and similar projects to some of the ones that I mentioned at the end.
Yeah. No, totally. I wanted just like, if you allow me, like, I would just say, like, I would have to, I wanted to quote Za'ev Jabotinsky, the one who wrote The Iron Wall, that it was kind of a manifesto that then used by the so-called Israeli Defense Force to and Likud party. He's like the father of the Israeli colonial army. And in this text, he says, like very shortly, Zionist colonization, this is his words, Zionist colonization must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach. He's talking, of course, about the technological aspect in to save the colonial power from interaction with the native population. No? Also in this text later, he I don't know, he cites many of the Spanish conquistadors in Latin America, of course, to like his transferring knowledge from the Spanish colonialism and also the use of technology in this colonial processes, and also then applying it as a European on the colonization of Palestine. No? Then like how you mentioned also later, Edward Said and the struggle for visibility within also the invisibility. Like you have like the Fidai, for example, figure from the early Palestinian revolution, or even the 36 revolution, or the first Intifada and the second. You have like a very different ways of covering the face and to be able to interact with spaces, but also like I want also like do another quote, and that's it, from Paul Virilio, Popular Defense and Ecological Struggles. He says, those who claim that the Palestinian struggle is not a popular defense are right. It is a popular assault turned suicidal because they have no choice. After their geographical disappearance, their last objective was to ensure that the Palestinian people would not disappear from the memory, as it had disappeared off the face of the map. If they had stopped being legal inhabitants of the earth as migrants, they still had one specific territory, the media, from airport runways to railroads, tracks, from highway to television and the press. Here he's talking about, of course, like from the 65 till basically the 77, like this era of Palestinians struggles competing with the colonial accelerations, you know, with the motors, airlines, Lufthansa, all these interactions between the motor, the crash, and the struggle. Here we talk like it's the Palestinian struggle, and also the visibility of the Palestinians, again, as a popular defense. Then also you cited Subcomandante Marcos and Zapatistas. We've been actually just doing like a reading on digital Zapatistas, or digital Zapatistas from Jill Lane text, but also like in this text, they're citing this text by Domingos, like Digital Zapatismo, where he talks more, I mean, you know, maybe from the, how it's called, the civic society disobedience theater. So yeah, this is a very long introduction, and I'm really like kind of excited about this whole thing, because in the recent month there was like a lot of things happening from the, like how you said, Soleimani, but then when we thought that this is the worst, then we interacted, there was like the COVID-19, the biological virus, and then we had the internet, Zoom, and all this communication, massive or mass digitization, actually, I would say. And then NASA and SpaceX trip to, of course, now they are doing like this whole launch to prepare for Elon Musk's Starship to go to Mars. And the last week was or 10 days ago, there was an announcement from the United Arab Emirates of their also Hub mission to go to Mars. And what they said, or like in the press release, they were talking about survival mission, that this is our last hope to survive as Middle Eastern people. And they're talking about the Middle East also. Like it's really weird because this is the first time that talking about Mars and occupy Mars, colonization of Mars related to the Middle East as geography. So I wanted to ask you, or maybe not to ask you, I wanted to talk with you, or I wanted to, I hate to use this word, elaborate, but maybe to talk more on popular defense, native technologies, and also this survival narratives from, yeah. I love this a lot, actually. I'm like all over the place now.
No, I mean, thank you for many of those references, which are also important to me. I don't know if I can answer it all here, but I want to say, since you mentioned Ricardo Dominguez and the civil disobedience online that he helped facilitate, and the work that he was doing essentially to help border crossers between San Diego and Tijuana through apps that he developed, as well as through targeted attacks on the Department of Homeland Security website, and a lot of hacktivism, that Alex Rivera and Zach Blass both worked with him. So many of the artists that and filmmakers I'm looking at, this is really a collective practice. I mean, it's not them individually, it's that they were all there at University of California, San Diego, thinking about what is the largest border crossing in the world in terms of how many people pass back and forth between San Diego and Tijuana daily. And of course, we're now at a moment 20 years later where the militarization of that border has only dramatically increased, and we have a president that is openly stating the things that were just happening behind the scenes with Clinton, Bush, and Obama. So the rhetoric is much more openly hateful, but the construction of that fence began after NAFTA, that is, after the shifts in labor flows from that act passed by Clinton, and after the Zapatista uprising in response to it. This was what this is the moment that led to the build the wall that Trump picked up on 15 years later, as if there weren't already a wall there. So in terms of resistance practices, I mean, those are some of the, I think, utopian moments in hacktivism, this ability to collectively reuse tactics of programming that, at this point, in the same way that I think when I have read the Cyborg Manifesto with students now, or when I just reread it, it's sort of her optimism, her utopianism around the cyborg sometimes feels unimaginable, I think, from the present. I think at that time that was still, the Web 1.0 moments, Ricardo Dominguez and Alex Rivera to some extent, and Misha Cardenas, I should mention, were reclaiming the World Wide Web as a space for resistance in a way that's it's harder to carve autonomy, in part because of the inability to be opaque online. So maybe then that's a way to also answer your question by saying that, we have to think about opacity as a digital and IRL practice in some way, that, the technological tools are not themselves enough, and that those artists who are, I think, depending primarily on the digital tools are some of the artists whose work I'm least interested in, because it either depends in a kind of extraordinary technological knowledge that's only available to certain experts with a lot of access, or it just doesn't look at the ways that surveillance and state repression impacts people of color, colonized people, people who are othered in one way or another in real life, and not just through sort of data gathering practices that are primarily felt online. So yeah, so I think one of the things when I'm speaking about what repair looks like is that these can't be purely technological tactics. And so, you know, thinking about masks worn by Fedayeen or by Zapatistas is as important.
Great. Okay, so maybe we can now open the floor for some questions from the audience. If anyone has a question, please just go ahead and unmute yourself. But yeah, I want to say, Kareem, thanks a lot. Like, this was very insightful and touched upon much of the conversations, concepts, theory that made this exhibition project possible.
Thank you, Jude. Yeah, I mean, it was a great exhibition to think with.
Hi, do you mind, I have a question. Hi, Kareem. Thank you so much. This talk was brilliant. I really enjoyed listening to you talk about all of this. I have a question. It's kind of a comment, but something I'd like you to respond to, something I think about, and you know, my work has a lot of affinities with yours. But like this sort of myth of like the efficacy of these technologies and the insuperability of them, you know, like in terms of like drones, like they often go missing. They're really not efficient. And you touched on that with like that, you know, terrible bug splat campaign. But this is also when you talk about checkpoint regime, talking about like Palestinian resistance to the occupation and the surveillance regimes and the ways that Palestinians, indigenous Black folks are able to actually find the holes and, you know, the talk about like the porocratic nature of borders and things like that. So yeah, if you could sort of speak to the fallibilities of these technologies and how this myth of their impenetrability has been sort of problematic, I think, and some sort of theories on them that present them as, you know, they're like impermeable.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'm glad you make it. So one thing I'd say is that strategically, of course, we should, you know, always underscore those fallibilities and try to extend on sort of cracks in the system in terms of where it shows opportunities. But I also would say that that's why I, from, you know, initially being interested in art practices that spoke about resistance, sort of turned away from this language of resistance and from a lot of the rhetoric associated with it, because it sort of assumes that the dominant framework is totalizing and then duplicates it by using the same powerful tools against the system. And that's what, you know, again, as much as I respect the projects in many ways, sort of the problems I have with some of the problems I have with projects by, say, Adam Harvey or by Trevor Paglen, very well-known counter-surveillance projects. But it's also why I think Indigenous studies, for example, have turned to refusal and resurgence as opposed to resistance when speaking about what it is to fight continuing forms of colonialism, because it's also, to paraphrase the artist Kojo Ashun, it's not about speaking truth to power, it's about turning one's back to power. It's about not recognizing the forms of governance that have come to be so hegemonic, and instead retrieving practices that have persisted because those forms of power are not infallible. So, you know, in some way amplifying and expanding on everyday practices of opacity and relation and refusal and many other words we could use in order to think about reparative and transformative work without ceding that you have to sort of fight back with the same tools that the dominant system uses, because those tools are only presented as that powerful. Yeah.
Anyone else like to ask a question?
Yeah, can I, I'm just gonna show my face so you're not like talking to like an egghead. Thank you, Kareem, and thank you to Darat for this. Oh my God, sorry, it's curfew. Thank you so much, this was fantastic. I had a question, kind of just going back to the physicality of, or the importance of, I mean, this is kind of like, you started with posits, like one needs to be able to physically manipulate, right? And I'm sort of wondering about your thoughts on like the physicality of the apparatus of telepresence, like, you know, our screens, or like the anthropomorphic kind of robot you had in that image, or a drone, which, you know, a drone has a screen on the other side of it. And I'm just sort of thinking of where do these, I don't know, like cross-diegetic doorways kind of sit within that physicality that your telepresence has to sort of affect, or Posit's telepresence has to affect?
Yeah, thanks, Mace. That's a good question, because actually what the mediating surface, the screen that is the portal in telepresence, right? And, you know, telepresence is, I'd say, not just about a window onto the world, but a portal in the sense, if we're talking about being able to act in the remote environment. But so what happens to the surface that provides that portal, and how do we think about its physicality? I mean, there's all kinds of work in media studies on the infrastructures of the internet, the ecological waste, the way that, you know, our materials are extracted from mines, often through exploitative labor, and then end up back in trash heaps in global South countries. So there's certainly an ecological analysis to the surface that is important, but also, you know, the drone I wanted to focus on, not just because I'm interested in the warfare elements, but also because the drone is itself an object that is so present to those below it. In terms of physicality, it's often the sound that is most disturbing, especially to Palestinians in Gaza. That's something, you know, there's a word, zanana, that comes from the nagging sound of the drone. It's something that's noticed in Pakistan and elsewhere, where the drone is too high up to see, but it can be heard and becomes a traumatic trigger in many ways. So yeah, I mean, thinking about physicality and thinking about the mediating surface or the object also gets us to think away from the visual, which I think is important more broadly, you know, because telepresence is not just about seeing. It's not television. It's not, and we typically, because there's such an ocular bias in Western theory and in so many elements of life, we don't focus enough on the other sensory aspects. Also, just in terms of the robot that you mentioned, I mean, I brought that robot picture up, but I didn't get to go into it. The same technology was used one time when I was at a talk at Brown University that was part of the Palestinian Studies Conference. These telerobotics are also being developed primarily in Israel, and it was a way that a Zionist lobbying group made themselves present physically for a talk to which they said they were not invited, although it was a public talk. But they, you know, there was someone from this Zionist lobbying group, Stand With Us, that was on a screen attached to a robot that was at the back of the auditorium as I think it was Haneen Zoabi spoke. You know, it was interesting not only as a kind of attempt to, you know, object to Palestinian speech and the Palestinian narrative, but also the physicality, because it was, like with so many elements of Israeli warfare and technology, a way to say, hey, look at this technology that we can sell to you. Look at what we're developing. We're a great, you know, tech hub, not just the political narrative of Zionism, but also the narrative of exceptionalism as a liberal democracy producing high tech that should be associated with the United States and the West. So yeah, there are all kinds of things that the presence of a physical medium can do.
Kareem, I was wondering whether we can also sort of reflect on materiality and embodiment, especially in reference to the digital Zapatistas, since a lot of these practices, like the digital sit-ins, are about making a collective political presence felt online, right? So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on embodiment and materiality and presence in relation to that?
So I'm not, you know, the digital sit-in, I mean, I'm trying to think about ways that the kinds of projects they were doing may or may not be possible now, 15, 20 years later, in terms of the trajectory of the internet, which has changed so radically since then, in a movement from anonymity to identity, from links to the real world to their absence. But just, you know, I mean, I guess broadly speaking, whatever digital forms of protest exist, I think it's important to note that embodied protest still remains the most powerful at both an affective and a political level. That, you know, what we're seeing in hundreds of cities across the US and across the world are tens of thousands of people, you know, adding up to millions collectively, who, despite the risk of COVID and despite curfew orders and despite the brutal repression of militarized police, are showing up in person, are risking their bodies because of the importance of embodied protest, both for the protesters themselves to feel their own power, their own collective power, and to feel the kind of joy that comes from being among people and feeling free, and also the impact that it just has at a physical level in terms of disrupting political life. This is my cat, Marwa, being a material embodied presence here. She was very patient for an hour and a half. So I hope that answers the question. I think she put an end to it.
Okay, perhaps we can take one or two more questions before we end. Okay, so actually Arish typed a question that I can read out loud for you, Kareem. So she said, yeah, so going back to the point on opacity, glissant, suggesting new ways to understanding someone else while accepting the impossibility of complete coherence and comprehensibility. What do you think are the potential outlets or detours, or maybe even questions to ask that can enable one to create relational spaces that can help in understanding that which is not necessarily limited to the visible/seen? Cute.
So that's a good question. And also, Glissant, of course, initially is not speaking about the visible and seen. He's a poet and a writer who's primarily concerned with language and translation. And so we can first, go back to thinking about opacity in literature and in translation. I'm not, a translation studies scholar, but I did get into Glissant from a background in comparative literature before I was really attracted to his work as a kind of counter-surveillance strategy. And what I'd say there is that, many writers who, because of the publishing industry, are compelled to write in English, have resisted the kind of exceptionalization of words that are not common in English, whether they are vernacular terms from the languages they speak, slang of different forms, or just simply a common word in another language. Practices could be not italicizing and not explaining a foreign word, so that there's a kind of opacity to something that you're reading that you don't understand, but through the kind of identification with characters without knowing fully their language, you have to come into a kind of learning of what that word is contextually. It's partly that I know some Arabic, though my Arabic is limited since I grew up in the US all my life, that when I'm reading Palestinian literature and translation, I'm also often frustrated by the kind of footnote that, explains what Habibi is. Like, do we need that? And, from many different perspectives, from like the, from a Chicana perspective, from an indigenous perspective, from so many different, languages that come into English and have to inhabit English if they want to be read. I think that that's just a small detail that points to what it is to create relations with opacity outside the visible or seen. And, more broadly, I'd point to the images from Bassel Abbas and Rouane Abou Rahme's videos as just something symbolic that can be abstracted more broadly. Because in my dissertation project, one of the sort of ways that I'm contextualizing contemporary Palestinian visual culture is to speak to so many artists and filmmakers' dissatisfaction with operating within a political and aesthetic sphere so shaped by NGOs and international law, in which the predominant expectation is that you make Palestinians visible, understandable, humane. Basically, if you put it into an image, this kind of frontal image that reveals all the expressions, even perhaps all the bloody details of a Palestinian subject. So what is it, instead to think across media about establishing relations of solidarity with someone that you cannot come to know through, say, a face. Zach Glass speaks about a face as something that is only scanned and calculated in an age of biometrics. But I think we could also speak in terms of the optics of liberal humanitarianism. We could speak about this as a legal or ideological regime as much as a technological one. So what does it mean in that context to think about a subject with their back turned, or a subject that is facing away, but in which you're invited to witness what they are witnessing, to join them in some way, not through fully knowing them, not through fully understanding, and not through, as Glissant would put it then, reducing by comparing to a scale that is already given. So opacity for Glissant is ultimately about the abolition of a kind of scale. It's about difference as multiplicity, difference as a singularity that can't be reduced, calculated, or in some way converted into quantitative measure from a top-down perspective like that of surveillance in the visual sense, but that transcends the kind of visual metaphor of opacity.
Hi. Can
Hello.
I ask a question? I mean, first of all, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture, and thank you for being so articulate. I think in some way, kind of not being able to navigate these texts, it made it so much easier to grasp. I have a question that I think I mean, I'm maybe confused more than anything. That I mean, between kind of speaking in the beginning about the right to be seen and opacity and invisibility, that there lies this ground, especially I think in relation to kind of race struggles, where you know, I wonder where is that fine line between, you know, being kind of, you know, opacity as a way to kind of, you know, fight against surveillance to the point of kind of opacity in actually renouncing the site of struggle itself. So in the idea that kind of hiding my blackness or concealing that if it were kind of in race, and I mean, this might be kind of born out of a misunderstanding which I have, but I just wonder if it's a relevant kind of point.
Yeah, I don't think it's a misunderstanding. I think it is a paradox that many of these thinkers and that I am grappling with, because so many popular struggles coming from people who have not been seen in a fundamental sense are about becoming visible. And that's why, you know, I mentioned the Edward Said quote about the desire to be visible, but also why, you know, Zach Glass is positioning his work largely within LGBTQ struggles in the United States, and there's a huge debate about the meaning of visibility, because visibility led to forms of legislative change that led to a kind of assimilation in which queer people could be married, could be seen as a family like any other American family. But many radical queer thinkers feel that this was assimilationism without transformation, right? That visibility was so limited and limiting that you know, there was a restriction of perspective that, for example, foreclosed seeing and recognizing that the beginning of the queer rights struggle, say the riots at Stonewall and elsewhere, were led by trans women of color who did not want a kind of assimilationism, that they wanted something other than visibility. They wanted autonomy. They wanted the capacity for collective care. And so this is, you know, this is just it's a very big political problem. And the Zapatistas are an example of opacity at both an aesthetic and a political level, because they primarily withdrew from the state, right? They set up a kind of autonomous zone in which they had local indigenous leaders saying that, you know, the Mexican state has only been murderous and extractive, and that they want to distance themselves from a settler colonial polity. And so they want to create their own modes of organizing. You know, this is just a broader problem in dissenting politics, whether to demand visibility as a way towards getting reforms from the state that protect an oppressed people, or to disidentify with visibility at an aesthetic level and state modes of organization at a political level. Because of course, representation has this double meaning embedded in it, the political and the visual. Do we want to be represented politically? Do we want to be represented visually? And how do those come together or come apart?
Thank you.
Does anyone have one final question? Because I guess we're running out of time. So after this, we're going to end. Any final thoughts? All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kareem. This was very insightful and interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed it. We're gonna actually have, like, our next event is taking place in 2 weeks. We're going to be hosting Amani Abu Rahma again. So stay tuned and goodbye, everybody. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Jude.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kareem.